The crack of a whip split the evening air over Prosperity, Arizona Territory, 1876, as Winifred Taylor pressed her face into the dusty wooden planks of the town's lone church. Blood trickled from a gash on her cheek, her dress torn at the shoulder. The Bible she'd been reading from lay sprawled open beside her, pages fluttering in the hot desert breeze. "I told you what would happen if you kept preaching that filth in my town." Sheriff Jedediah Blackwood loomed over her, leather whip dangling from his meaty fist. His badge gleamed in the setting sun, a mockery of the justice it was meant to represent. "Women don't read scripture in public. It ain't natural, and it sure ain't welcome here." The small crowd that had gathered shifted uncomfortably. No one moved to help Winifred, though several women dabbed at tears while their husbands studied their boots. This wasn't the first time Sheriff Blackwood had made an example of someone, and the good people of Prosperity had learned to keep their protests silent. Winifred struggled to her knees, her trembling fingers reaching for the leather-bound Bible. At 22, she had already endured more hardship than most twice her age. Orphaned during the journey west, she'd found herself alone in this harsh land with nothing but her faith and determination. "The word of God is for everyone," she whispered, her voice hoarse but unwavering, "even for those who would silence it with violence." The sheriff raised his whip again, face contorted with rage. "You need another lesson in respect, girl. That'll be enough." The deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped forward, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Dust clung to his worn leather chaps, and the revolver at his hip had clearly seen use. His face, partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, bore the weathered lines of a man who'd spent years under the unforgiving western sun. Sheriff Blackwood's hand froze mid-air. "This ain't your business, Mason. I'm making it my business." Mason Wilder's blue eyes were cold as he surveyed the scene. He hadn't planned to stop in Prosperity, was just passing through on his way to Tuxen, but some things a man couldn't ride past. "Last I checked, reading the good book wasn't a crime in any territory." The sheriff lowered his whip slowly, clearly calculating his odds. Mason's reputation as a former Texas Ranger preceded him throughout the territories. The woman was causing a disturbance. "Only disturbance I see is a lawman beating a defenseless woman." Mason stepped closer to Winifred, keeping his eyes on the sheriff. "You all right, miss?" Winifred nodded slightly, though the movement sent pain shooting through her temple. She clutched the Bible to her chest like armor. Mason extended his hand to her. "Pick up your Bible, miss." When she had done so, still kneeling in the dirt, he added, "Now read it again. This time at my table." A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one had ever so openly defied Sheriff Blackwood. The sheriff's face flushed dark red. "You're making a mistake, Wilder. Wouldn't be my first." Mason helped Winifred to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. "But hitting a woman for reading scripture might be yours." He turned to the gathered townspeople. "Anyone here actually bothered by this lady reading from the Bible?" Silence answered him. A few people shook their heads. "Thought so?" Mason gently guided Winifred toward the nearby saloon, the only establishment still open as evening approached. "Come on, miss, let's get you cleaned up." Sheriff Blackwood spat in the dirt. "This isn't over, Wilder." Mason didn't bother looking back, never figured it was. Inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, conversation halted as Mason led the battered young woman to a corner table. The piano player's fingers stilled on the keys, and the card players paused mid-deal. "Chester," Mason called to the barkeep. "Water and whiskey, if you please. And whatever food you've got ready." The bartender nodded, too stunned by the unusual sight to question. Winifred sank gratefully into the chair, her legs no longer able to support her. She'd never been inside a saloon before. Good Christian women didn't frequent such establishments, but at that moment, she was too exhausted and in too much pain to care about propriety. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible. Mason took the seat across from her, positioning himself to keep an eye on both the saloon doors and the windows. "No need for thanks. That wasn't right, what he did." Chester brought over a pitcher of water, a glass of whiskey, and a clean cloth. "Kitchen's closed, but I can rustle up some beans and bread." "That'll do fine," Mason replied, sliding the whiskey toward Winifred. For the pain, he explained when she looked at it dubiously. Winifred hesitated, then took a small sip. The liquor burned her throat, but the warmth that spread through her chest was not unwelcome. She coughed slightly, then allowed Mason to dampen the cloth and gently clean the blood from her face. "My name is Winifred Taylor," she said, wincing as the cloth touched her cut. "I arrived in Prosperity 2 months ago to teach at the school." Mason's touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so calloused. Mason Wilder, just passing through. He examined the cut on her cheek with a critical eye. "This'll heal clean if it's kept from festering." "What possessed you to read the Bible in public if you knew the sheriff's feelings on the matter?" Winifred's green eyes flashed with unexpected fire. "I didn't know until the first time he warned me, and I don't believe God's word should be silenced because one man with a badge and a whip says so." A slight smile tugged at Mason's lips. "Can't argue with that." He sat back as Chester returned with a plate of beans and a chunk of bread. "Eat something, you'll need your strength." As Winifred ate, Mason observed her more carefully. Beneath the dirt and blood, she was striking, not conventionally beautiful, perhaps, but with a quiet dignity and strength that made her memorable. Her auburn hair had come loose from its pins and fell in waves around her shoulders. Despite her ordeal, she maintained a straight-backed posture that spoke of inner resilience. "Have you family in town?" he asked. She shook her head. "No family anywhere, not since the cholera took my parents 5 years back on the trail to California." She tore off a piece of bread. "I've been making my own way since then." Mason nodded, understanding more than he let on. "The school board hired you knowing you were on your own. They were desperate for a teacher." A hint of bitterness tinged her voice, "though they may reconsider after tonight." The saloon had gradually returned to its normal level of activity, though many patrons cast curious glances their way. Mason was aware of the whispered conversations, the speculation about his intervention. News traveled fast in small towns, and by morning, everyone would know what had happened. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house." Winifred hesitated. "Though I'm not certain she'll welcome me back now. She's the sheriff's sister-in-law," Mason cursed under his breath. "Seems you've landed yourself in quite a fix, Miss Taylor. Please call me Winifred." She placed her Bible on the table, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. Would you still like me to read from it?" Something in her earnest question touched Mason in a place he'd thought long hardened. "Yes," he said, surprising himself. "I would." Winifred opened the Bible carefully to where a ribbon marked her place. Her voice, though still raw from crying, grew stronger as she read. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" As she continued reading the 27th Psalm, Mason found himself transported back to childhood memories of his mother reading those same words by candlelight. He hadn't set foot in a church in over a decade, not since the war had stripped him of whatever faith he'd once possessed. Yet something in Winifred's quiet conviction stirred embers he'd thought long cold. When she finished, the saloon had grown oddly quiet. Several men had removed their hats, and even the hardened gamblers seemed momentarily reflective. "Thank you," Mason said quietly. "It's been a long time since I heard those words." Winifred closed the Bible. "They're just as true now as they were then. Perhaps." He drained his own glass of whiskey. "You need a safe place for tonight. The hotel across the street should do. I'll pay for a room." "I couldn't accept. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "Blackwood's the type to hold a grudge. Best you're not alone tonight." After settling her in a room at the Prosperity Hotel with strict instructions to bar the door, Mason returned to the saloon for a final drink. As expected, Sheriff Blackwood was waiting for him, flanked by 2 deputies. "You made me look a fool today, Wilder," Blackwood growled. Mason sipped his whiskey. "You managed that all on your own." The sheriff leaned closer. "That woman's been causing trouble since she arrived." Filling the children's heads with notions about equality and women's rights, reading scripture is just the beginning. "Sounds dangerous," Mason replied dryly. "A woman teaching children to read and think for themselves. I can see why you'd need a whip to handle that." Blackwood's hand twitched toward his gun. "You're leaving town at first light, and you're leaving alone." Mason met the sheriff's gaze steadily. I go where I please when I please, and I'm not in the habit of abandoning folks who need help." "Then you're a dead man," Blackwood spat, turning to leave. "Both of you." After the sheriff stomped out, Chester slid another whiskey toward Mason. "On the house. Been a while since anyone stood up to Blackwood." "Why does the town tolerate him?" Mason asked. Chester shrugged. "He keeps the peace, mostly. Sure, he's heavy-handed, but the alternative is no law at all." He wiped the counter with a rag. "Course, he's been worse since that schoolteacher arrived. Something about her just sets him off." Mason considered this as he nursed his drink. There was more here than a simple case of a lawman overstepping his authority. Something personal. When he finally made his way to his own room, sleep eluded him. Through the thin wall, he could hear Winifred moving about restlessly. Twice he heard muffled sobs that made something in his chest tighten. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He found her in the hotel dining room the next morning, her face pale but composed. The cut on her cheek had scabbed over, and she'd managed to mend her dress as best she could. "Good morning, mister." "Wilder," she greeted him. "Mason," he corrected, taking the seat across from her. "I've been thinking it might be best if you left Prosperity for a while." Her face fell. "I can't leave my students." "You can't teach them if you're dead," he said bluntly. "Blackwood made it clear he's not done with you." "I won't be run out of town for doing what's right," she insisted, lifting her chin. Mason leaned forward. "I'm not suggesting you run. I'm suggesting a strategic retreat. I'm headed to Tuxen. Come with me. Once there, we can send for a U.S. Marshal to investigate Blackwood. There've been rumors about him for years, but no one's had the courage to make formal complaints." Hope flickered in her eyes. "Do you really think that would work?" "It's worth trying." He didn't mention that it would also remove her from immediate danger. "We'd leave this afternoon." Winifred considered his proposal, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on the tablecloth. "I'll need to speak with the school board and collect my things." "I'll come with you," Mason said, in a tone that brooked no argument. The school board meeting was brief and tense. 3 men and 2 women listened to Winifred's explanation of her temporary departure. While they expressed sympathy for her predicament, their relief at her leaving was palpable. "We'll hold your position for 1 month, Miss Taylor, Mr. Parsons," the board chairman told her. "After that, we'll need to seek a replacement." "I understand," Winifred replied, her voice steady despite the disappointment Mason could see in her eyes. These people had hired her, then abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. As they left the meeting, Mason placed a protective hand at the small of her back. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "Can't entirely blame them." "Fear is a poor excuse for cowardice," she replied, but there was more sadness than anger in her voice. At Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house, they encountered their first real obstacle. The landlady stood in the doorway, arms crossed, refusing to let Winifred enter. "You've brought shame to my establishment," the older woman declared. "I'll have your things packed and sent to you." Mason stepped forward. "Madam, Miss Taylor has paid for her lodgings. She has every right to collect her belongings herself." Mrs. Abernathy's gaze flicked to Mason's holstered revolver. "Very well. 5 minutes." Inside, Winifred moved efficiently, packing her modest wardrobe and few personal possessions into a worn carpet bag. Mason stood guard at the door, aware of Mrs. Abernathy hovering nearby. "Is this everything?" he asked as Winifred closed the bag. She looked around the small room, her gaze lingering on a shelf of books. "I can't take those. They belong to the school." Mason frowned. "Pack what you can. I'll buy you new books in Tuxen." The simple offer brought unexpected tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. "Thank you." As they descended the stairs, Sheriff Blackwood was waiting in the parlor. He stood as they entered, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Leaving so soon, Miss Taylor?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And here I thought you were dedicated to educating our youth." "I am," she replied evenly. "Which is why I'll be returning once proper authorities have reviewed your conduct." Blackwood's smile vanished. "You threatening me with the law, girl, not a threat," Mason interjected. "A promise." The sheriff's gaze shifted between them. "You two deserve each other, the soiled dove schoolteacher and the washed-up gunslinger." Mason's hand moved toward his revolver, but Winifred's touch on his arm stopped him. "We're leaving now," she said calmly. "Step aside, Sheriff." For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwood might refuse. Then, with deliberate slowness, he moved away from the door. "This isn't over." "No," Mason agreed, guiding Winifred past him. "It isn't." Outside, Mason led her quickly to the livery where he'd stabled his horse. "We need to hurry," he said, securing her carpet bag to his saddle. "Blackwood won't let us leave town without a fight." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The proximity was improper, but necessity overrode propriety. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and he felt her stiffen momentarily before relaxing against him. As they rode down the main street, townspeople stopped to stare. Some nodded in silent support, others turned away. No one tried to stop them, and for a moment, Mason dared to hope they might leave Prosperity without further incident. Then gunfire erupted from the sheriff's office. A bullet splintered the hitching post beside them as Mason dug his heels into his horse's flanks. The animal leaped forward, and Winifred gasped, clutching Mason's arm. "Hold on tight," he shouted as they galloped toward the edge of town. More shots followed, but they were already pulling away, the distance making accuracy impossible. Once they'd put several miles between themselves and Prosperity, Mason slowed to a more sustainable pace. Winifred was trembling against him, her breath coming in short gasps. "Are you hit?" He asked urgently. She shook her head. "No, I've never been shot at before." Despite everything, Mason found himself chuckling. "First time for everything." She twisted to look at him, incredulous. "You find this amusing?" "Not amusing, exactly." He adjusted his hold on the reins. "But there's something clarifying about being shot at, makes you appreciate being alive." Winifred considered this, then let out a shaky laugh. "I suppose it does." After a moment, she added, "Where will we camp tonight?" "There's a creek about 10 miles ahead, good water, some cover." He scanned the horizon, checking for pursuit. "We'll reach it before sundown." As they rode, the tension gradually eased from Winifred's body. She began to take in their surroundings, the vast expanse of desert, the distant mountains, the occasional cluster of cacti standing sentinel against the blue sky. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "I never took the time to really see it before." Mason nodded, though she couldn't see him. "The desert has its own kind of beauty, harsh but honest." Like you, he thought, but didn't say. By the time they reached the creek, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the landscape in gold and amber. Mason helped Winifred dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle after hours in the saddle. "I'll set up camp," he said, unsaddling his horse. "Can you gather some firewood?" She nodded, grateful for something useful to do. As she collected fallen branches, she thought about the strange turn her life had taken in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been a respectable schoolteacher. Today, she was fleeing across the desert with a man she barely knew, pursued by a corrupt sheriff. The absurdity of it made her smile despite the gravity of their situation. When she returned with an armful of wood, Mason had already laid out bedrolls on opposite sides of the small clearing and was digging through his saddlebags. "Not much for dinner, I'm afraid," he said, pulling out jerky and hardtack. "We'll need to hunt or find a trading post tomorrow." "It's more than enough," she assured him, arranging the wood for a fire. She watched as he expertly struck a match and coaxed the flames to life. "You've done this often, too often." He settled back on his heels, watching the fire grow. "Been on the move most of my life." As darkness fell, they ate their simple meal in companionable silence. The night air grew cool, and Winifred wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Here." Mason shrugged out of his long coat and draped it around her. "Desert nights get cold. Thank you." She pulled the coat close, inhaling the scent of leather, tobacco, and something uniquely him. "For everything," he nodded, poking the fire with a stick. "Get some rest. We've got a long ride tomorrow." Winifred moved to her bedroll but didn't lie down. Instead, she took out her Bible and opened it. The firelight made reading difficult, but she knew many passages by heart. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began softly. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Across the fire, Mason listened silently, his face unreadable in the flickering light. When she finished, he spoke. "My mother used to read that one after my father died. It brings comfort," Winifred said. "Knowing we're not alone, even in our darkest moments." "Is that what you believe?" There was no mockery in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Yes, she closed the Bible. Faith isn't about having all the answers, it's about trusting there is an answer even when we can't see it. Mason considered her words. I used to believe, before the war between the states, he nodded, saw too much death, too many prayers unanswered. Winifred chose her next words carefully. God doesn't promise we won't suffer, only that we won't suffer alone. Mason's eyes met hers across the fire. You've suffered your share, haven't you? We all have. She held his gaze. It's what we do with that suffering that matters. Something shifted in Mason's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight relaxation of his jaw. For a moment, Winifred glimpsed the man beneath the hardened exterior, and what she saw moved her deeply. Get some sleep, he said finally, his voice gruff. I'll take first watch. As Winifred settled into her bedroll, she found herself studying Mason's profile against the night sky. He was a contradiction, a man capable of violence who treated her with gentleness, a cynic who'd risked his life to defend her right to read scripture. She wondered what experiences had shaped him, what wounds he carried beneath his calm exterior. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, she drifted into an exhausted sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of Mason moving around the camp. Dawn was just breaking, the eastern sky painted in shades of pink and lavender. Morning, Mason greeted her, offering a tin cup of steaming coffee. Sleep well, Winifred sat up, accepting the cup gratefully. Better than I expected. She took a sip, wincing at the bitterness. Though I'm not used to sleeping outdoors. You'll get used to it. He crouched beside her. How's your cheek feeling? She touched the cut gingerly. Sore, but healing. Mason nodded, seemingly satisfied. We should reach Tuxen in 3 days if we make good time. There's a trading post about half a day's ride from here where we can resupply. As they broke camp and prepared to depart, Winifred noticed Mason scanning the horizon frequently. Are you expecting pursuit? She asked. Always expect trouble, he replied, helping her mount. That way you're never surprised when it finds you. The day's ride was hot and dusty. Winifred's muscles ached from the previous day's unaccustomed riding, but she didn't complain. Mason pointed out landmarks and wildlife as they traveled, and she found herself enjoying his commentary and the rare glimpses of humor he revealed. By midday, they reached the trading post, a weathered wooden building with a corral and water trough. Several horses were hitched outside, and the sound of voices drifted from within. Mason dismounted first, then helped Winifred down. Stay close, he murmured, his hand lingering on her waist a moment longer than necessary. Inside, the trading post was crowded with merchandise and customers. A grizzled man with one eye stood behind the counter, haggling with a pair of Apache men over the price of rifle ammunition. Other customers, miners, cowboys, and what appeared to be a family of settlers browsed the shelves or sat at a small table drinking whiskey. Conversation paused briefly as Mason and Winifred entered, curious eyes assessing them before returning to their business. Mason guided her toward the counter, where the one-eyed proprietor had finished with the Apache customers. What can I do for you folks? The man asked, his single eye moving between them with undisguised interest. Supplies for the trail to Tuxen, Mason replied. Beans, coffee, bacon if you've got it, and a canteen for the lady. As the proprietor gathered their supplies, a burly man in dusty trail clothes approached Winifred. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey, and his smile revealed several missing teeth. Ain't often we see a pretty lady in these parts, he slurred, standing too close. You with this fella, or might you be interested in better company? Before Winifred could respond, Mason stepped between them. She's with me, he said quietly. Move along. The man scowled. Didn't hear the lady say so. I'm saying so, Winifred spoke up, her voice firm despite her unease. Please step back, sir. For a tense moment, it seemed the man might refuse. Then he spat on the floor and turned away, muttering obscenities under his breath. Mason's hand, which had moved to hover near his revolver, relaxed slightly. You all right? Winifred nodded, though her heart was racing. Yes, thank you. They completed their purchases quickly after that, eager to be back on the trail. As they mounted up, Winifred noticed Mason's increased vigilance. What's wrong? She asked once they were underway. Those men back there, he replied, scanning the trail behind them. They were asking the proprietor questions about us, description of my horse, which way we were headed. Winifred's stomach tightened with fear. Blackwood's men, maybe, or just curious. Either way, we'll take a different route than planned. He turned their horse off the main trail onto a less traveled path that wound through a rocky outcropping, harder to follow, harder to ambush. As they rode, the landscape grew more rugged. By late afternoon, they were traveling through a narrow canyon, high walls of red rock on either side. The air was still and hot, the only sound the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. "It's like being in a cathedral," Winifred observed, gazing up at the towering walls. Mason followed her gaze. "Nature's own kind of church, I suppose. Do you miss it?" she asked. "Going to church?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "I miss the certainty, the feeling that there was order in the world, a plan, that good would be rewarded and evil punished. And now I know better." His voice was flat. "Good people suffer. Bad men prosper. If there is a God, he doesn't concern himself much with justice down here." Winifred considered his words. Perhaps justice isn't God's only concern. Perhaps he's more interested in mercy. Mason's arms tightened briefly around her. "You're a strange woman, Winifred Taylor. Most people would be cursing God after what happened to you. Would that change anything?" She turned slightly to see his face. "Would it heal my wounds or bring Sheriff Blackwood to justice?" A reluctant smile tugged at his lips. "I suppose not." "Then I choose faith," she said simply. "It gives me strength when nothing else can." Something changed in Mason's expression, a softening, a glimpse of vulnerability quickly hidden. "I envy you that." Before Winifred could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the canyon. Mason jerked, a grunt of pain escaping him as he slumped forward against her. "Mason," she cried, feeling warm wetness seeping through his shirt onto her back. "Ride," he gasped, straightening with visible effort. "Fast as you can." More shots rang out, bullets kicking up dust around them. Mason dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and they surged forward as he drew his revolver. He fired blindly toward the canyon wall where the shots had originated. Winifred clung to the saddle horn as they galloped through the canyon. Behind them, she heard shouts and the thunder of pursuing hooves. Mason's breathing was labored, and she could feel him weakening. "You're hit," she said, panic rising in her throat. "Just a graze," he managed, though the growing stain on his shirt told a different story. "Need to find cover." They burst out of the canyon onto an open plain dotted with sparse vegetation. In the distance, a small cluster of buildings shimmered in the late afternoon heat. "There," Mason pointed. "Might be friendly." It seemed an eternity before they reached the settlement, a rancher's homestead with a main house, barn, and several outbuildings. As they approached, a man emerged from the barn, rifle in hand. "That's far enough," he called. "State your business." "Need help," Mason replied, his voice alarmingly weak. "Shot. Being pursued." The rancher assessed them quickly, then lowered his rifle. "Bring him in," he called to Winifred. Quick now, as they reached the barn, Mason slid from the saddle, nearly taking Winifred with him. The rancher caught him, supporting his weight. "Martha," he shouted toward the house. "Get the medicine box and hot water." Inside the barn, they laid Mason on a bed of clean straw. Winifred knelt beside him, her hands pressing against the wound in his side to slow the bleeding. His face was ashen, his breathing shallow. "Stay with me," she pleaded, tears blurring her vision. "Please, Mason." His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with effort. "Not planning on leaving," he murmured. "Just got shot is all." A woman hurried into the barn carrying a wooden box and a steaming pot. "Move aside, child," she told Winifred gently. "Let me see him." Reluctantly, Winifred shifted to give the woman access to Mason's wound. Her hands and dress were stained with his blood, and she felt a dizzying wave of fear at the sight. "William," the woman addressed her husband, "get the children inside and keep watch. If there's trouble coming, we need to be ready." The rancher nodded grimly and left the barn. "I'm Martha Wilson," the woman told Winifred as she cut away Mason's shirt to expose the wound. "That's my husband, William. You're safe here for now." "Winifred Taylor," she replied automatically, her eyes fixed on Mason's pale face. "He was shot protecting me." Martha examined the wound carefully. Bullet went clean through, that's good, but he's lost a lot of blood. She looked up at Winifred. I need your help. Can you follow instructions? Winifred nodded, pushing aside her fear. Tell me what to do. For the next hour, she assisted Martha in cleaning and bandaging Mason's wound. The older woman worked efficiently, her practiced movements suggesting this wasn't the first gunshot wound she treated. You're lucky, Martha told Mason as she tied off the final bandage. Inch to the right and you'd be meeting your maker. Mason managed a weak smile, not sure he'd want to see me. He'll see all of us eventually, Martha replied matter-of-factly. Ready or not, she turned to Winifred. He needs rest now, and you look dead on your feet yourself. I'm fine, Winifred insisted, though exhaustion and fear had left her trembling. I need to stay with him. Martha's expression softened. There's a cot in the corner, you can rest there and still keep an eye on him. I'll bring you both something to eat. Once Martha had gone, Winifred moved the cot closer to Mason and sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. His skin was clammy, but his pulse felt stronger than before. You shouldn't have taken that bullet, she said softly. His eyes opened, clearer now. Couldn't very well let you take it. Why are you doing this, Mason? Risking your life for someone you barely know? He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Some things a man can't walk away from, some wrongs need righting. Is that all it is, a wrong that needs righting? Mason's gaze held hers, and something in it made her heart beat faster. No, he said simply, that's not all it is. Before she could respond, William Wilson entered the barn, his expression grim. Riders coming, 4 of them armed, should be here in about 20 minutes. Mason tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. My gun, you're in no condition to fight, William said firmly. I've got my sons and hands, we can handle this. These men won't hesitate to kill, Mason warned. They're not here to talk. William's weathered face hardened. Neither am I if they threaten my family. He turned to Winifred. Martha's waiting at the house to get you cleaned up and hidden. Go with her. I won't leave Mason, she protested. Go, Mason told her. Please, Winifred, I can't protect you like this. The fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her, finally convinced her. She squeezed his hand once before standing. I'll be back soon. At the house, Martha quickly helped Winifred wash the blood from her hands and change into a clean dress borrowed from her daughter. Then she led her to a hidden space beneath the kitchen floorboards. Root cellar, Martha explained, lifting a trapdoor concealed by a rug. Used it during Apache raids years back. They won't find you here. What about Mason? Winifred asked, reluctant to descend into the darkness. William's moving him to the hay loft. If there's trouble, it's better they don't find either of you right away. Martha's kind eyes held Winifred's. Have faith, child. God hasn't brought you this far to abandon you now. With those words echoing in her mind, Winifred climbed down into the cellar. Martha handed her a lantern and a pistol. Do you know how to use this? She asked. Winifred nodded. Her father had taught her the basics of shooting before his death. Yes, good, only as a last resort. Martha squeezed her hand. Now pray, child, for all of us. The trapdoor closed, plunging Winifred into semi-darkness broken only by the faint glow of the lantern. She sat on a crate, the pistol heavy in her lap, and did as Martha suggested. She prayed. Above, she could hear muffled voices and footsteps as the Wilson family prepared for their unwelcome visitors. Time stretched endlessly in the confined space, each minute feeling like an hour. Then she heard the sound of approaching horses, followed by shouts and the unmistakable voice of Sheriff Blackwood. Wilson, we're looking for fugitives, a man and woman. We know they came this way. William's reply was too muffled to make out clearly, but his tone was firm. The conversation continued, voices rising. Then a gunshot split the air, followed by a woman's scream, Martha, and the chaos of a firefight. Winifred gripped the pistol tightly, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. More shots, the sound of breaking glass, a man's cry of pain. Then, terrifyingly, the trapdoor above her rattled. She raised the pistol with trembling hands, aiming at the opening. The trapdoor lifted and a face appeared, not Blackwood or his men, but William Wilson, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Come quickly, he gasped. They've set fire to the barn. Winifred scrambled up, the pistol still clutched in her hand. The kitchen was in disarray. A window shattered, bullet holes in the walls. Martha was tending to one of her sons, who sat clutching a bloodied arm. Outside, flames leaped from the barn roof, illuminating the night that had fallen while Winifred was hidden. Two bodies lay in the yard, one of Blackwood's men and someone she didn't recognize, perhaps one of Wilson's hands. "Where's Mason?" she cried, scanning the chaotic scene. "Still in the loft," William replied grimly. "Blackwood and his remaining man are trying to flush him out." Winifred didn't hesitate. She ran toward the burning barn, ignoring William's shout to stop. The heat hit her like a wall as she approached, but she pushed forward, ducking inside through a side door. Smoke filled the interior, making her eyes water and her lungs burn. "Mason." She called, coughing. "Mason, where are you?" A shot rang out, the bullet splintering the doorframe beside her. Winifred dropped to her knees, crawling deeper into the barn. Through the smoke, she could make out two figures, one on the ground near the main doors, the other moving toward the ladder to the loft, Sheriff Blackwood. Without thinking, Winifred raised the pistol and fired. The recoil jolted through her arms, but her aim was true. Blackwood staggered, clutching his shoulder, then whirled toward her. "You," he snarled, raising his own gun. Another shot echoed through the barn, but it wasn't from Blackwood's gun. The sheriff jerked, a look of surprise crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground. From the loft, Mason appeared, his face streaked with soot, one hand pressed to his bandaged side, the other holding his smoking revolver. "Winifred," he called, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Get out!" A burning beam crashed down between them, sending up a shower of sparks. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the dry hay and wooden structure. "Not without you," she shouted back, circling the fallen beam. Mason made his way unsteadily down the ladder, nearly falling on the last few rungs. Winifred rushed to his side, supporting him as best she could despite their difference in size. "Can you walk?" she asked, coughing as smoke filled her lungs. He nodded grimly, leaning heavily on her. "Have to." Together, they staggered toward the side door, the heat intensifying with each step. A section of the roof collapsed behind them, and Winifred felt her dress singe as embers rained down. Just when it seemed they wouldn't make it, strong hands grabbed them, pulling them through the doorway into the night air. William and two of his sons half carried, half dragged them away from the burning building. "Thank God," Martha cried, rushing to meet them. "We thought you were lost." They collapsed onto the grass a safe distance from the barn, gulping clean air into their scorched lungs. Mason's wound had reopened, fresh blood staining his bandages, but he was alive. "Blackwood?" William asked. "Dead," Mason replied flatly. "His man?" William nodded toward the body in the yard. "Won't be bothering anyone again." Martha knelt beside them, checking their injuries. "You both need proper care. The doctor in Reed Rock is a day's ride from here." "Tomorrow," Mason said, his eyes on Winifred. "We'll leave tomorrow." Later, cleaned and rebandaged, they rested in the Wilsons' house. The barn was a total loss, but the family was intact, and for that, Martha gave thanks as she served a simple meal of stew and biscuits. "You saved our lives," Winifred told the family. "We can never repay you." William shook his head. "You stood against evil. That's payment enough in my book." He looked at Mason. "Recognized you from the start. Mason Wilder. Heard stories about your time with the Rangers." Mason shifted uncomfortably. "That was a lifetime ago. A man's past shapes him, but it doesn't have to define him," William said. "What matters is what you do with the time you have left." After the meal, Martha showed them to a small guest room. "We're short on space with the barn gone," she apologized, "but there's a screen for privacy." Once alone, Winifred helped Mason to the bed, easing him down carefully. "You should rest," she said. "You've lost too much blood." He caught her hand as she turned to go. "Stay, please." She hesitated, then sat beside him on the edge of the bed. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. "In the barn. Takes more than a bullet and a fire to get rid of me." His attempt at humor fell flat as he winced in pain. Winifred's fingers gently traced the edge of his bandage. "Why did you come back for me in prosperity? You could have ridden on, stayed out of trouble." Mason's hand covered hers. "Some things a man can't ride past, some people." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "Some people change everything just by existing." Her breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "Mason, I've lived a hard life, Winifred, done things I'm not proud of, been alone so long I forgot what it was to care about anyone. His voice roughened. Then I saw you, standing up for what you believed in despite the cost, and something in me woke up. Tears filled her eyes. I was so afraid. I know, but you did it anyway. That's courage. His hand moved to cup her cheek. The kind of courage I thought was gone from the world. Winifred leaned into his touch. What happens now? Blackwood is dead, but the world's still full of men like him, Mason finished. We go to Tuxen as planned, report what happened. Then, he hesitated. That depends on you, on me, on whether you want to go back to prosperity. Or, he took a breath, or if you might consider another path. Hope bloomed in Winifred's heart. What other path when we walk together? Mason's voice was low, uncertain. I've got a small ranch outside Santa Fe, nothing fancy, but it's peaceful. Good land, good water. Been meaning to settle there for years, just never had a reason to stay in one place. His eyes met hers. Until now, Winifred's heart raced. Are you asking me to come with you? I'm asking for a chance, he said simply. A chance to be the man you deserve, to build something that lasts. She felt tears spill onto her cheeks. You barely know me. I know enough. His thumb gently wiped away her tears. I know you're brave and kind and stubborn as hell. I know you believe in a better world, even when everything around you says otherwise. He smiled faintly. And I know I've never met anyone like you. Winifred covered his hand with hers. I've never met anyone like you either. She took a deep breath. Yes, I'll come with you to Santa Fe. She smiled through her tears. Yes, I want that chance. Mason pulled her gently toward him, and their lips met in a kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I'll be a good husband to you, Winifred Taylor, if you'll have me. Her heart soared at the word husband. Is that a proposal, Mason Wilder? The worst one in history, he admitted with a soft laugh. Bleeding, half dead, with nothing to offer but a rundown ranch and a complicated past. And a future, she added. Don't forget the future. Our future, he agreed. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hand tangling in her hair. Winifred lost herself in the kiss, in the warmth of his touch and the promise of tomorrow. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she moved to the other side of the screen to prepare for sleep, though she found herself wishing for the courage to stay beside him. Winifred, Mason's voice came softly through the screen. Yes. Would you read to me, from your Bible? She smiled, touched by the request. Of course. She retrieved her Bible and returned to sit beside him on the bed. Opening to a familiar passage, she began to read. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. As she read, Mason's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. In that moment, despite all they had endured and all the uncertainties that lay ahead, Winifred felt a peace she had never known before. The journey to Tuxen took 3 days, during which Mason's strength gradually returned. The Wilsons provided them with a wagon and supplies, refusing any payment beyond a promise to visit when they could. In Tuxen, they found a sympathetic U.S. Marshal who took their statements about Sheriff Blackwood and promised to investigate conditions in prosperity. The town would need a new sheriff, he told them, preferably one who understood that the law existed to protect all citizens, not just those with power. You could go back, Mason told Winifred as they left the marshal's office. Take up your teaching position again. Make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. She considered this briefly, then shook her head. My path lies elsewhere now, she squeezed his hand. With you, they were married the next day in a small church at the edge of town. The ceremony was simple, just the two of them, the preacher, and an elderly couple who served as witnesses. Winifred wore a new dress of pale blue calico, purchased with money Mason insisted on spending despite her protests about economy. He himself wore a clean shirt and his best and only suit, his hair freshly cut and his face cleanly shaved. As they exchanged vows, Winifred felt as though her heart might burst with joy. This was not the life she had imagined for herself when she'd arrived in prosperity with her teaching certificate and her Bible. It was something wilder, more unpredictable, but also more vibrant and real than anything she could have planned. That night, in the privacy of a modest hotel room, they came together as husband and wife. Mason's touch was gentle, reverent, as though she were something precious he feared might break. Winifred discovered depths of passion she had never known existed, her body awakening to sensations that made her gasp and tremble. Afterward, lying in the circle of his arms, she traced the scar on his side from the bullet wound. "Does it still hurt?" "Not anymore." He kissed her forehead. "Nothing hurts when I'm with you." They set out for Santa Fe the following week, traveling at an easy pace to accommodate Mason's still healing wound. The journey took them through some of the most beautiful and challenging terrain of the Southwest, across desert flats where the horizon seemed endless, through mountain passes where pine trees swayed in the breeze, alongside rivers that cut through ancient rock. Each night, they made camp together, sharing stories of their lives before they met. Mason told her about his childhood in Texas, his years with the Rangers, the war that had nearly destroyed his faith in humanity. Winifred spoke of her parents, their dreams for her education, the loneliness she'd endured after their deaths. "I never thought I'd find a home again," she confessed one night as they lay beneath the stars. "Not a real one." Mason's arms tightened around her. "You have one now, with me." As they neared Santa Fe, Mason grew both excited and nervous. "It's been nearly 2 years since I was last at the ranch," he admitted. "Don't know what condition it'll be in." His concerns proved warranted. When they finally crested the hill overlooking his property, the small adobe house stood intact but neglected. The corral fence had collapsed in places, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. "It's not much," he said apologetically as they approached. "I should have warned you." Winifred took in the weathered structure and the land surrounding it, good grazing land, with a creek running nearby and mountains visible in the distance. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. "It's ours." The next weeks were filled with hard work as they repaired and cleaned the house, rebuilt the corral, and planted a small garden. Mason purchased cattle from a neighboring rancher, the beginning of what he hoped would become a successful herd. Winifred set up a kitchen, sewed curtains for the windows, and arranged their few possessions to make the house a home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. Often, Winifred would read from her Bible, her voice carrying on the still air as Mason listened, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to a cautious renewal of faith. "I still don't understand God's plan," he told her one evening. "Still don't know why good people suffer. But I'm starting to think maybe there is a plan after all." Winifred smiled, her hand finding his. "What changed your mind?" He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her palm. "You did. Finding you in that dusty little town, that wasn't chance." Their life settled into a rhythm of work and companionship. Mason's skills as a rancher returned quickly, and under his care, the cattle thrived. Winifred, though initially unfamiliar with ranch life, proved a quick learner and willing partner in all aspects of their operation. Word spread about the new settlers, and neighbors began to visit first out of curiosity, then out of genuine friendship. Mason, who had spent so many years avoiding connections, found himself unexpectedly welcomed into the community. 6 months after their arrival, Winifred discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled them both with joy and trepidation. "A baby," Mason marveled, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Winifred asked, searching his face. "Happier than I ever thought possible," his voice roughened with emotion. "And terrified. What do I know about being a father?" She cupped his face in her hands. "You know about love, about protection, about standing up for what's right. That's what our child needs most." As Winifred's pregnancy progressed, Mason became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and take on fewer chores. She complied to a point, but remained determined to contribute to their life together. "I'm carrying a child not made of glass," she reminded him when his protectiveness became overbearing. "Women have been doing this since Eve." "Not my woman," he countered. "Not with my child." Their first Christmas at the ranch coincided with a heavy snowfall that transformed the landscape into a glistening wonderland. Unable to travel to town for church services, they held their own celebration at home. Mason surprised Winifred with a rocking chair he'd secretly crafted in the barn, and she presented him with a hand-knitted scarf and a pocket watch she'd ordered months earlier from a catalog. That night, as they sat before the fire, Mason's arm around Winifred's shoulders and her head resting against him, she felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" he asked, noticing her tears. "I was just thinking about that day in prosperity," she said. "How something so terrible led to something so wonderful." Mason's hand moved to rest on her rounded belly, where their child grew stronger each day. "God works in mysterious ways," he said, the words no longer foreign on his tongue. "That's what you always say, isn't it?" She smiled up at him. "Yes, and I believe it more every day." In the spring, as wildflowers carpeted the meadows around their ranch, Winifred gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. The labor was long and difficult, leaving Mason pacing outside their bedroom while the midwife from a neighboring ranch tended to his wife. When he was finally allowed in, the sight of Winifred, exhausted but radiant, holding their tiny daughter, brought him to his knees beside the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the downy head, "just like her mother." "She has your eyes," Winifred replied, smiling through her tears, "and I think she'll have your stubborn streak as well." As Grace grew, so did their ranch. Mason's herd increased, and they were able to hire hands to help with the expanding operation. Winifred, once Grace was old enough, began teaching the children of neighboring ranchers and their workers, turning their front room into a small schoolhouse 3 days a week. And every Sunday without fail, they gathered first just the 3 of them, later joined by workers and neighbors to read from the Bible. Sometimes Mason would read, his deep voice giving weight to the ancient words, but often it was Winifred, just as it had been that fateful day in prosperity. On Grace's 3rd birthday, as they celebrated with friends and neighbors who had become like family, Mason pulled Winifred aside. In the quiet of their garden, with the sounds of laughter drifting from the house, he took both her hands in his. "I've been thinking," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. "A dangerous pastime," she teased. He smiled. "Perhaps, but I've been thinking about prosperity." Winifred's smile faded. "What about it?" "I received a letter from the marshal last week. Things have changed there. The new sheriff is fair-minded, the town's growing, but," he paused, "they still don't have a proper school or a church." Understanding dawned in Winifred's eyes. "You want to go back?" "Not to stay," he clarified quickly. "Our home is here, but maybe to help. To show them what a real community could be." He squeezed her hands. "What do you think?" Winifred considered the idea. The memory of prosperity no longer brought fear or anger. Time and love had healed those wounds. But there was something appealing about returning, not as victims fleeing persecution, but as people who could make a difference. "I think," she said slowly, "that would be a fine thing to do when Grace is a bit older." Mason pulled her into his arms, his kiss a promise of all they had shared and all that was yet to come. Over his shoulder, Winifred could see their daughter playing with the other children, her laughter ringing out across the yard. From that first moment in prosperity, when a stranger had stood up for her right to read God's word, to this moment of love and purpose and belonging, it had been a journey she could never have imagined. Yet somehow, it felt like the most natural path in the world. "Read to me tonight." Mason asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Winifred smiled, remembering the first time he'd made that request. "Always," she promised. "This time and every time at our table." And she did, for all the years that followed, through joys and sorrows, through the birth of 2 more children, through the building of a school in prosperity and a proper church on their own land. Through decades of a love that had begun with a simple act of courage and kindness in a dusty western town. In later years, when their grandchildren gathered around to hear the story of how their grandparents met, Mason would always begin the same way. "Your grandmother was beaten for reading a Bible out loud, but I said, 'Read it again,' this time at my table." And Winifred would smile, remembering not the pain of that day, but the beginning of a love that had transformed both their lives. Time passed, as it must. The ranch prospered, their children grew and had families of their own. Mason's dark hair turned silver, and lines of laughter etched themselves around Winifred's eyes. Yet through it all, their love remained constant, a testament to the power of courage, faith, and second chances in a wild and unforgiving land. And every night, without fail, they would sit together, and Winifred would open her Bible, now worn and well-loved, and read the ancient words that had brought them together. Mason would listen, his hand in hers, grateful beyond measure for the woman who had taught him to believe again in God, in goodness, and in the healing power of love.